Clear, it's not a prediction of any future event. It's talking about something that's already happened. For a child has been born for us, it's past tense, a son given to us, authority rests upon his shoulders, and he shall be named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Now, if you look at the context of this, it's talking. It's an ongoing conversation where Isaiah is talking to King Ahaz, and Ahaz gives Ahaz a sign, and the sign is a young woman or a virgin who will conceive, and she's already conceived, and his name rather, is Emmanuel, God with us. So this is not a prophecy. It's talking about events that are happening in the lifetime of Isaiah said already.
The past is used, is not the future.
Now, you may ask, how can a human being in Isaiah's time be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace? It's a good question.
What are you reading?
Verse 6 of chapter 9. There are a number of places actually in the Bible where human beings are called God.
Yes.
For example, Psalm 45 verses 6 and 7, where the king, perhaps Solomon, is directly addressed as God. Another example will be in 1 Chronicles 29 at the end of the chapter, where it's Solomon again actually. He sits on the throne of Yahweh and is worshipped by Israel. Actually, of all things, it's a little known verse, and I could go on, but I will go on. Okay, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Melchizedek is addressed as Elohim, and passages in Isaiah and other passages which refer to Yahweh, Melchizedek
in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Dead Sea Scrolls. I know it's not in the Bible, but it's in Jewish literature from the 2nd century BC or thereabouts. Melchizedek is directly called Elohim, God, and his name replaces the name of Yahweh in biblical quotations in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there are other examples I can give you. What I'm trying to say is that by calling someone God, it doesn't mean that you really think they are Yahweh. What you're doing, you're in the fashion of that time, it happened in Egyptian culture as well, human beings could be addressed with a divine title because they had a divine role. So we shouldn't necessarily assume that if Jesus is addressed in divine titles, it necessarily means that he is Yahweh. He could be like these other...
but then Jesus confirms that he existed before his humanity.
Well, only in one gospel, in the fourth gospel, the last to be written. In Matthew and Luke's gospel, in the nativity narratives, Jesus is the Son, is created in the womb of Mary. There is no hint of pre-existence of Jesus in Matthew and Luke. He's not incarnated. He's not a pre-existent. If you look at all the Gospel of Luke and Gospel of Matthew, he is not a pre-existent. Only the very last gospel written towards the end of the 1st century. Suddenly now, he becomes an eternal pre-existent being, a divine figure. But in the earlier Gospels, he's not. And this has been noticed by biblical scholars. And if you look at the nativity narrative, it's a birth story. It actually says in the Greek that God created the Son in the womb, and he became the Son of God when he was created in the Greek, in the womb of Mary. That's when he became the Son of God in Luke, and that's when he became the Son of God in Matthew. There's no sense that he pre-existed, although it's there in John. But is that, well, the other Gospels don't necessarily agree, and is that historical? That's another question.
Well, but that's the thing, I think it depends, it's the audiences as well. You know, Mark was written for the Jews, John was written for the church. So he's obviously explaining the full divinity of Christ, because when he had come, I think, you know, he's clarifying to the church his whole divinity, and that's why you see the kind of progression, whereas, you know, each book of the Gospels was kind of written to a different audience, and that's why you can see some different miracles and focusing on different things, whereas I think John finishes on, Mark finishes on, I think, the crucifixion. Let me just double check so I say it correctly. Yeah, so Matthew was obviously, it was written to a Jewish audience, and John was written kind of towards the church. So Matthew ends with the resurrection, and John finishes with the promise of a return, and then obviously you have Revelation and stuff like that. So I don't see that as an issue. It's just each gospel is being written to a different audience.
I agree completely. They are written to different audiences. What I disagree was that for the gospel writer of Luke, the gospel according to Luke, the Son of God, Jesus, came into existence at his conception. He was created as the Son in the womb of Mary. Ditto for Matthew. It's not that Luke also agrees with John and has an eternal pre-existent Son. No, for Luke, the Son of God was created in the womb of Mary. So I think Luke has a different understanding, a different Christology than John does. The earlier Gospels have a less exalted view of Jesus. In fact, the earliest Gospel written, that of Mark, has a very human Jesus, one that denies he is God in Luke chapter 10, verse 17. Jesus can't do things, he can't work miracles in his hometown because of people's lack of faith. He's unable to do things. In the later Gospels, he becomes more exalted, he's given higher titles, he becomes Lord, people address him as Lord. And then in John, he becomes a pre-existent divine being. So what we're seeing is a development, an elevation, and an exaltation of Jesus as the story gets told and retold over the decades after Jesus. If you rewind the clock back to the earliest account we have, that of Mark, you don't find Jesus being God. You find Jesus as someone who denies he is God, in Mark 10:17 I mentioned, who on the cross says, my God, why have you abandoned me? And is unable to do miracles in his own hometown because of other people's unbelief. Who gets angry, for example, when the fig tree is not producing fruit out of season. Well, why would it? But anyway, he gets angry, and so on. And there are many other examples one can give. But these are all toned down, or they're changed, or they're non-existent in the later Gospels, leading up to John Gospel, where you have a very exalted Jesus, who is now the pre-existent Son with the Father from all eternity. But you don't find that in the earlier Gospels. If it was true, if Jesus spoke like that historically, then Mark would have recorded it, Luke would have recorded it, Matthew would have recorded it, but none of them do. It's only in John that he goes around saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Before Abraham was I am the resurrection and the life, etc., etc. All these amazing I am statements are only found in one Gospel, the very last to be written at the end of the first century. If Jesus had publicly gone around speaking like that, I would argue, then Luke, who carefully investigated all these things in the beginning, he says in Luke chapter 1, would surely have mentioned it too. Why would he ignore such amazing claims? Why would you ignore them? You would mention them. What audience who he was writing to would not have wanted to have known these things? But nowhere in Luke does Jesus ever speak like that or teach like he does in John. That's led scholars, biblical scholars, to conclude that the earliest Gospels are more like the historical Jesus, and John's Jesus is a highly interpreted account, reflecting the beliefs and the theology of the author of John's Gospel, whoever he was. And it's the least historical of the four. That's what most biblical scholars in the world today think.
What do you mean it's the least historical?
Because it is the furthest removed from who the real Jesus was like.
Okay.
Because if you look at the earlier Gospels written close to the time of Jesus, they don't portray Jesus in that amazing, exalted way. They have a much more human portrayal of Jesus. So you have to ask, which is more likely to be historical? The last one to be written, or the earlier one to be written? The three earlier ones. And scholars, 99% of scholars have chosen the earlier Gospels to be more likely to be historically reliable about the historical Jesus, what he said, what he did, what he taught. Okay. Because Jesus of John's Gospel teaches very different things than the earlier Gospels do. And I don't think the argument is just the different audiences works. Because then you have to ask, why would Luke, who had carefully investigated all of Jesus' life from the beginning and carefully giving his friend Theophilus, why would he ignore this amazing teaching? It doesn't make any sense to me. The most important thing in John, that Jesus claims to be the light of the world, and yet all the other Gospels ignore it? How likely is that if Jesus really went around publicly? So scholars tend to think that Jesus didn't really actually say any of this stuff in John, that it's made up basically, unfortunately. And these are Christian scholars in the main who also say this. And this isn't known by the men and women in the pew in churches. They don't know this. They don't know what their own scholars are saying. And part of my job down here when I talk to Christians is to share with you what your own scholars are saying, because your own pastors and ministers are not letting you know this, unfortunately, in the main. And that's part of the scandal of what's going on at the moment. Over to you.
So, do you know that when you're referring to...
He's letting that settle in, I think. Do you have any... I mean, I'm just kind of dumping this all on you, but I'm just trying to share with you some of the difficulties that reputable biblical scholars have at taking at face value everything in the four Gospels. There are problems they have noticed, and they've come up with explanations as to what is a more likely Jesus than the less likely Jesus.
Okay. But then, obviously, from the earlier Gospels, you still have, the crucifixion, the resurrection. Fair enough. It didn't. Mark portrays Jesus more as the Messiah. Because I think who it's addressed to is very important, because you don't necessarily. Mark is trying to address a Jewish audience that this is the Messiah that's come.
How do you know Mark is trying to address a Jewish audience? Where do you get that idea from, by the way?
Because if you look at most of the content,
Matthew. I think you mean Matthew, perhaps. Mark is a Gentile. Mark's Gospel explains Jewish customs to its readers. It wouldn't do that if the audience was already Jewish. Matthew's Gospel doesn't. It assumes a familiarity with the Jewish law, and Matthew's Jesus expects his disciples, his followers, to obey the Jewish law in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. So I think Mark is actually written to a Gentile audience, and the teaching of Jesus is adapted for that Gentile audience.
Yes.
Matthew is written for a Jewish audience, so Jesus' teaching is adapted. When I mean adapted, it's changed to fit a Jewish kind of audience. So what did Jesus really say? Did he speak like he does in Mark, or like he does in Matthew or John? We don't really know, but I have my own view on that. He spoke more like Matthew than Mark. But you're right, all the Gospels have Jesus claiming to be a Messiah. That's Islamic belief as well. And they all have the crucifixion. Mark doesn't have the resurrection, of course, but I'll allow that he believed it. Absolutely right. These are Christian documents. You're right.
Yeah. So then, obviously, in terms of this, I don't disregard in John. If we even, look at historians believe that John died around 108, about the end of the first century or so. So these documents are even within his timeline. So I fail to kind of see as to why this would be, if John is someone that was connected to Jesus, it doesn't matter if it's, 60 years removed, because it's got, historically we know that John died around the end of the beginning of the second century, end of the first century. So these documents will kind of be in line with his actual being. So by this time you have the church developing, and he's clearly writing a document to the church clarifying, the divinity of Christ, who he was. Maybe there's sometimes, so in terms of theology and whatnot, things have been expounded upon as the years go along, but it's not a case of that he's just kind of invented something new just to say, okay, Christ was God, and so such and such.
I think a problem that many scholars have, and I share their concern, is that the four Gospels we have are all anonymous. It doesn't give a name, identify a named person who wrote them. And you might say to me, how can that be true? It says the Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel of Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah.
But if you actually read the four Gospels, there's nothing in the Gospels themselves that identify who the author is.
But does that make is that an important issue?
Yes,
because I would place more emphasis on the historical attestation through those documents rather than, because you can write your name on a lie, a lie can always change, but the truth stays the same. So when you have people who actually examine the claims in the Bible alongside certain occurrences at the time, we can see that there is a lot of truth into what is said. Yes, you may say things like, Mark and the zombies, or various other little things on here or there, but on the majority, without going too in depth in the more contentious things, that we can see this aligns to what we know of, can establish from outside sources. So in terms of who actually wrote it, because you even have the I keep mispronouncing the word, but the Mauritanian text, which obviously alludes to
Mauritanian fragments.
Yeah, sorry, that's it.
It's a text, yeah.
Which alludes to who the actual writers of the gospel were. So, and that's something that was, I think, from the second century. So we have something very was close to the source, whether it's at 100, 150 years, alluding to who, or confirming who these actual people were. So just because you didn't have this person's surname, you know, first and
There were no surnames in those days. Apart from very, very wealthy people. The average Joe didn't have surnames.
Yeah, so I think you have text confirming, you know, it's not just something that, you know, just made out of thin air. So again, like the Mauritanian thing for me is enough authenticity. I don't think anyone's come and said this is a fake or forged document. So I give it quite a lot of credence as it explains to a reader who the Gospels are linked to.
The Gospels are thought usually by scholars considered to be anonymous, that we don't know who the authors were, for several rather impressive reasons. One is the Gospels themselves don't claim to be by any particular person, and they don't claim to be eyewitness. To take Matthew, for example, the first Gospel, it does not claim to be written by Matthew.
Yes.
It's written in the third person, so it's not saying I saw Jesus do this. And when Matthew is mentioned in the Gospel, it's just very briefly and in passing. There's no sense of the author himself suddenly appearing in the narrative. That doesn't happen. Another consideration is that nearly all of Jesus' disciples were peasants, but in a socio-economic sense. I don't mean I'm putting them down. I'm saying these were unlettered,
well, Matthew
untutored. Matthew, who was a tax collector, he was not one of the higher tax collectors in Galilee who would have had to read and write. The lower order of tax collectors who just collected money would not have been necessarily literate. But note also that the disciples were Aramaic-speaking people. They didn't normally speak Greek. All the Gospels are in Greek, not in Aramaic. Secondly, the authors of Matthew, for example, wrote quite sophisticated Greek. So you would have to say the Apostle Matthew, who's not mentioned in the Gospel, both could read and write Aramaic, could read and write sophisticated Greek. That is extremely unlikely to most historians. He didn't go to university. He didn't go to sixth form or get A-levels. None of that existed in those times. None of his disciples had a further education because it didn't exist unless you were very, very, very wealthy at the top elite 1%.
Yeah, but even Luke says he got these are from eyewitness testimonies and such and such.
So he's not an eyewitness either then?
No, but he was a historian. So, I mean, his claim is he's got these from very well attested sources.
Has he? Let's test it. Now, I'm now going to fast forward this because it's dangerous going to turn into an academic seminar, and that's not going to work down here unless I get paid for it. The common understanding amongst New Testament scholars is that Matthew and Luke used as their sources the Gospel of Mark and another unknown source called Q. Q is short for Quell, source in German, and a few other bits and pieces, but mainly Mark and in addition Q. Matthew has, as I say, has taken Mark and edited and changed and adapted Mark towards his own purposes, sometimes changing the words of Jesus to say slightly different things. Luke has done the same. I can go into reasons why scholars, the vast majority of scholars, are pretty much convinced, as far as you can be with historical things, that this is what's happened. Luke also has used Mark. He's also used Q, which Luke shares with Matthew, to write his gospel. So we know mostly what Luke's sources really were. They weren't actually eyewitnesses so much as the Gospel of Mark and Q. And we can see what he's done with these sources, how he's changed and edited and heightened Jesus as well by changing certain things. So we actually know more or less what his sources were. And as I say, you can see a progression from a more perhaps fallible human Jesus in Mark to a more exalted Jesus in Matthew and Luke, who all the sharp bits, the uncomfortable sayings of Jesus in Mark have been eased off and they've been changed. I'll give you examples if you want, and they're not so troubling in Matthew and Luke because they've changed those sayings a little bit to make them slightly more palatable for readers. And then John, whoosh, suddenly John becomes the light of the world. He's not that in Mark. And his teaching is different in John as well. So we know who the sources were. The view is that we don't know who wrote any of the Gospels. Even Luke is, that's just a word, but we'll allow it was Paul's disciple, if you wish, Paul's associate. But another point is, the earliest time in history that we know that anyone called them Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John is not in the Muratorian fragment, it's in Irenaeus, who was a late 2nd century bishop in Lyon in France. And he actually, the first time anyone ever called what we call the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now this is over 150 years after the time of Jesus. When Matthew is quoted before then, and he is, say in the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, he is never quoted as from a gospel, like the gospel according to Matthew, I mean. It's quite possible these sayings were orally transmitted, and they were only written down, they were written down in his time perhaps, but he's quoting from an oral tradition. He never cites, and Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew, no one ever says that until Irenaeus towards the end of the 2nd century. The Moratorium fragment doesn't mention that, it's later. It's later than Irenaeus. So the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts. We don't know who wrote them. There's a degree of literary independence between them. We can see how Matthew and Luke have changed Mark and changed the teaching of Jesus to suit their own theology. And they're not that reliable historically. There are some things that are reliable, but some things that are probably made up. Some great examples in Matthew's Gospel about the zombie apocalypse, as you know about.
Well,
yeah, I mean, that's not historical, obviously. And other examples as well. But there are possibly historical things in them as well. But it's kind of a mixture of fact and fiction together. But John is mostly, I would argue, or predominantly fiction. And Mark is arguably much more historical. And that's the standard view you get at Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, Harvard, wherever you want to go, Berlin, the Sorbonne. This is kind of the standard conclusion that the overwhelming majority of scholars today, and have for the last 100 years, have come to. There's not some guy at Speaker's Corner. This you can check it out for yourself if you haven't already. So when Christians come and say, but Jesus said, I think, well, hang on, are you aware of all this stuff? You know, did he really say that? Where did he say it? Was it in John? Probably not historical. Blah, 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 blah. So it's quite complicated.
Well, I mean, I'm not like 100% well versed on all the scholarship on it. So some of these claims,
I'm not 100% either. There's thousands of scholars. But just the mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read too many of the mainstream scholars' work. I haven't even read like Bart Ehrman's stuff yet, which I intend to.
Should do.
You know, but so I can only say in terms of the basic stuff I know. But in terms of that, I would just say that I think in terms of consistency with, again, I keep going back to like the historicity of stuff in terms of when you even link it to the kind of early church fathers tradition in terms of who the apostles were. They're kind of following on from, in terms of teaching, so you have people like Polycarp and such. So it just seems like there's more of a narrative, because I think it's you've got Clement of Rome, and then you've got.
Have you read these people, by the way? Have you read these people? Have you read 1 Clement? Have you read the letter of Polycarp?
Have
you read them?
I've not read their works itself.
Because you're quoting them without saying you've read them. Okay, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
I mean, I have kind of read them, but
okay.
I'm saying I'm not sure what point you're making, but you've not read them, so what point are you making? I know these people exist, and I've read their
I'm more
stuff
alluding to the apostolic tradition of the apostolic churches. So in terms of, if these things are in terms of not historical or accurate, or kind of some sort of fabrications or deviations where you have an apostolic, because I can link it to my logical reasoning. So in terms of, you have these church fathers who were even linked to the early apostles, so you kind of seem to have a consistency going from the church foundation to the actual church foundation.
That's a very Catholic argument, Roman Catholic argument. Oh, you're not a Roman Catholic, are you?
No. But I can appreciate.
But
I can appreciate the historicity of the Catholic tradition, because even though I don't see necessarily the Catholic Church today as the same as when the term Catholic Church was found,
Ignatius of Antioch in 107 was the first to use that term in his letters. But it also did have anyway. That's a different story.
Yeah, but so that's how I see it.
Okay, I think there's a more. I hear what you're saying. I could reflect on what you've just said, but I'm not going to. I want to address something more fundamental than that. The teaching of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus, versus the gospel of the Christians, the gospel of Paul. What was Jesus, according to the earliest gospels, and I know that's a caveat, so I'm excluding later work, I'm excluding the church fathers. According to the earliest gospels, what was Jesus' message? What was his gospel he went around preaching in Judea? What was the gospel of Jesus? That's not a trick question. I just to clarify what was the teaching of Jesus, and then we'll move on to what was the gospel according to Paul? What did he preach about salvation, life, God, death, justification by faith, and all that stuff? So what was the gospel of Jesus? That according to Mark, that he actually went around. It says, and Jesus preached the gospel of God. It calls it the gospel of God, actually, in Galilee. So what was that gospel? What was the gospel of Jesus according to the earliest gospel we have? It's important we get to know what Jesus taught before we compare it to other people.
What in terms of
what Paul taught, what Christians down here believe today. Is it the same thing?
Obeying the laws.
Well, can you just give me a quote? Just refer to me. Would you like a Bible? And you can look the passages up.
Yeah, I've got
a special Muslim Bible. No, it's not. It's the Holy Bible, the New International Version. You prefer...
Oh no,
look at this.
I'll find
People today prefer their iPhones. What's wrong with the Bible? It's actually got page numbers and everything on.
That's it.
I prefer... Well, I got an iPhone as well. I got an iPhone X, I'll have you know. But I still prefer this for Dower. Because I've got all my underlinings in it and stuff. So all the passages have been highlighted.
So you want to know the message of Christ?
The gospel of Jesus. Couldn't be a step. All Christians, surely, if they follow Jesus, must know what the gospel of Jesus was. What did he go around preaching? It's not an obscure question. If I was to ask a Muslim, I assume you're a Muslim, right? What did Muhammad preach?
There's one God worthy of worship.
Yes. Perfect.
That's it. Simple.
Can you associate partners with this one God?
No.
No, you can't. Very simple message. Did he say that he was a prophet or a Messiah or nothing at all, Muhammad? What did he say about himself?
He's a prophet sent from Allah.
So he said. So the message was that there's one God without partners who created heaven and earth, and that Muhammad was the last prophet, the last prophet of God. That's very easy. Very easy. You could do that in your sleep, couldn't you? To be honest. Right. So we're asking the same question of Christians. What was the message of Jesus? What did he go around? According to your own scriptures, what did he go around preaching?
That he was the Messiah.
Did he? Okay.
Well, when he alludes to the, no, he did.
And was that his message? I'm the Messiah. Believe in me. Is that what his message?
But he's
in the early Gospels.
Yeah, but I'm giving you the whole overview of what he's preaching. Maybe I'm not kind of getting your point specifically, but in terms of how
I give you my point just to speed things up? Otherwise, it'll be a bit painful.
Because I would say it of my viewpoint, but it might not be corresponding with what you're.
I'm just going by what's in this book. Okay. I'm not trying to give you my opinion. I'm just trying to say this is what it says. Okay. If I'm wrong, please correct me. If I'm right, well, I'm right. Well, this text says what it says. According to, and this is what scholars have recognised as well. According to the Gospels, anyway, the earlier ones, Jesus went around preaching the kingdom of God. You probably recognise what I'm saying now, don't you? Yeah. So he's preaching that God's reign, God's rule, is now in a special way present in the ministry of Jesus. And through Jesus, God was bringing forgiveness through. There were miracles happened. God would work miracles through Jesus, and even the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the unclean or whatever were now welcome into God's kingdom. That seems to be you getting the sense that I'm saying is right. Yeah, you don't disagree with me? Okay. Jesus wasn't preaching himself, and this is the characteristic of the earlier Gospels. He didn't go around saying, "I'm God." He never said that in the early Gospels. He didn't say, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." He didn't say, "Before Abraham was I am," in the earlier Gospels. He pointed to God. Mark shows him, the earliest Gospel, praying to God. He's saying, in one place, a man came to Jesus and said, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said, "Why do you call me good? There is no one good but God alone." Yeah. He even denies that he is good. Now, I wouldn't say
that he was denying it, but he's saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's my interpretation.
Yeah, we would have to differ.
And I think Matthew thought that too, because Matthew changes Jesus' words in his own version of that story. I'll tell you what he says. In Matthew's version, a man comes to Jesus and says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus in that story says, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There's no one good but God alone." A very subtle but fundamental change. No, now he's not denying that he is God or good or divine. He's saying, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" So Matthew, I think, was aware of the embarrassment in Mark. Remember Matthew used Mark, we discussed this earlier on? And he subtly changes Jesus' words to remove the embarrassment. Jesus no longer denies, I think, that he is good or God. He asks a rather odd question. "Why do you ask me about what is good?" Well, you're the Messiah, mate. You should know about this. So he saves Jesus from an embarrassment, apparently, but actually has Jesus say something is quite silly. Jesus is saying a prophet, a Messiah. Why do you ask me what is good? Well, who else are we supposed to go to? You're the Messiah. So that's a bit embarrassing. But so in the earliest Gospels, Jesus is not the subject of his preaching, and neither is the Quran. Quran doesn't go on about Muhammad all the time, although it's addressed mainly to him. It goes on about God himself, about his purposes for mankind. The purpose of mankind is not Muhammad, it's God. And for Jesus, the purpose of mankind is God and not Jesus. But in the last Gospel, Jesus then becomes the centre of the Gospel. He is the Son with the Father. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Before Abraham, all these are marvellous sayings. They're not found in Matthew or Mark or Luke. None of our early sources have this. Only the very last to be written at the end of the first century. So that's a big change from the Gospel of Jesus to a very exalted Gospel. Now, what was Paul's Gospel? In Romans, in Galatians, what was the Gospel that Paul preached? So if I was to ask your Apostle Paul, what is the Gospel? What would he say?
Well, in terms of to the Gentiles.
What would he say? Well, you tell me. Were there two different Gospels, one for the Jews, one for the Gentiles? Is that what you mean?
Well, obviously, Paul's Gospel was kind of expanding on the fulfillment of the law in terms of the law applying to how it applied to like Jews and Gentiles. So in terms of being able to, you're not bound by the Mosaic laws and such. So Paul was actually clarifying what the Gospels of Jesus actually meant in terms of application to people.
Okay, well, I'll give you my answer. Is there in Romans 3, is there in Galatians? The Gospel that Paul preached was that Jesus died for your sins, or died for the world's sins, and through his death and resurrection, you find forgiveness of sins, or justification before God. Is that fair?
Yeah.
The Gospel is about Jesus' death and resurrection. Is that fair for Paul? Right, good. So let's compare these two Gospels, and of course they should be the same if Christianity is true. So the earliest Gospel has Jesus preaching about God and his kingdom, not about himself. Paul's Gospel is about Jesus' death and resurrection. Are they the same Gospel? Are they the same religion? Is it the same religion even?
Say that.
Is it the same religion? Is a better question. But I'm not going to be so harsh. Is it the same Gospel? Is it the same message? So Jesus says, this is the Gospel, blah, 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 blah. Paul says, this is the Gospel, blah, 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 blah. Is it the same message? No. Why isn't it the same message? Because one is the Gospel of Jesus preached. The other is the Gospel about Jesus, a message about someone else. And they're not the same. Now, Islam, the Quran particularly, is a call back to the original Injil, Gospel in Arabic, that was given to Jesus to preach. So we believe in the Gospel, but we believe in the Gospel that Jesus preached. We reject the Gospel that others who never, because Paul never met Jesus.
Yeah, but then Paul discussed with the disciples, and they didn't have an issue with what he was preaching. So it's
Didn't
not
they?
like
Okay.
well at the Council of Jerusalem, when it's about the circumcision and stuff like that. So Paul's obviously has met the apostles and he's discussed with them. So
okay, no, we'll go with that. Acts 15.
Okay.
We'll go to the Council of Jerusalem and we'll look at what